I'm David Eddy. I'm a self-taught painter. I live in Warwick, New York, and I'm a friend of Jim Tyack's. I met Jim, I think, for the first time about 6 years ago. We were in a group show up in Port Jervis together, and Jim had been asked to do a poetry reading, and he had a couple of paintings, and I befriended him then, and since that time we crossed paths as showing together and as being friends. When I think of Jim's paintings, I think of that appealing quality of spontaneity and access to things immediate. There was no limitation. There was no limitation to what he would put down in a piece of work, and he almost always did it at a sense of speed. I always get the sense in Jim's paintings that he was moving so fast and he had an idea, and whatever was next to him he grabbed, whether it was physical or in his head, and I like that quality as it appears in his work. He viewed art as something that was it was something you had in you that had to come out, and that it was everywhere, and there was value and worth in every effort that appeared. And I learned from Jim how to look at things for a little bit longer than I might have otherwise. He liked art. He knew art. If he didn't see it right away, he spent time looking for it. And if he didn't like it, he let that be known as well. One of the things that I wondered when I look at his work is, what was he thinking about? I know that, in his poetry and as people have recalled about him, there's reference to family and friends and things that are more concrete, and in his work there's more simple imagery and language that I find appealing. I don't know what exactly he was thinking of, except that he always seemed to be assembling things in his work. It looked like he had a thought, and as I said earlier, he was moving fast, and a thought would come in, and he'd reach for something to put down, and he might think about that and elaborate on it to a degree, but it always seemed to me in the components of his work that he wasn't ever anywhere too long, that something was coming into his head and there was another statement to be made, and it was a multitude of statements together, a storyline that was being created from a guy who was looking peripherally all the time that he was working. He'd be working 1 minute, grabbing something on a table and putting it down, and his mind would be telling him a thought next, or he'd be thinking about something else, and there was this kind of disjunctive quality.
I'm Linda Wyman. I'm a watercolorist. And so I must know Jimmy for 25, 26 years, and I've seen him go through his different stages and different styles of painting, and he's always been a painter. He always had this attitude that he really didn't care if anybody ever saw or enjoyed his art, which was a complete anachronism because he was so prolific. He worked all the time. Every single material, anything that you could come across, if Jim had tools, he would transform whatever it was in front of him into a work of art. Jimmy didn't really care how things were presented. He would take a piece of material, he would transform it, it would become something totally new, and then he really didn't care and wasn't interested whether or not this was going to be shown in a gallery, or whether it was going to be framed professionally, or whether it was going to be matted. It was what it was created, and there it was, and you looked at it.
My name is Don Alter, and I'm a painter. Yeah, I met Jim about 10 years ago, I assume. I think about 10 years ago, right? They were introduced by our mutual friend who is departed now, named Lou Donato, who was also a painter. And I always found Jim very exciting as an artist. He's very copious. He kept turning stuff out all the time. We would sit in a restaurant, for example, and he would take the placemat, start pouring ketchup on it, salt, pepper, scratching into it with a toothpick or a straw. I mean, he was creating all the time. I was so happy to have been in Jim Tyack's company because he was always very excited about painting and art, and the mind was always working. He's very open. He was very broad-minded about what he thought art was, and everything was food for him. Whatever he looked at was just something that he responded to. I'm sure a lot of it was he responded to verbally in his poetry, but then there was this whole other side, a visual response. Watching Jim work, that he was very impulsive. In other words, if he had crayons in his hand, crayons went into the work. If he had chicken bones went into the work. Whatever was near him was food for him to manipulate in terms of his visual imagery. He was just very open. I mean, whatever came out was of value to him. And I found that extremely exciting.
Jim had a wonderful way of creating depth, layers of spray paint, his texture, wonderful sense of composition.
His color, not necessarily color that I would choose, or you take parts of Jim's paintings and you say, well, gee, I don't like that color particularly, and I don't like that color, but Jim would put all these colors together in a painting with some lines and some forms, and all of a sudden the colors started to work in a way that you never would have thought they would. I related to his work because he was similarly self-taught. He had an accessible imagery and language that I related to. Little houses, people with moody expressions, simple little statements that he was able to make just by virtue of cutting a piece of paper out and putting it over a piece of color and some aluminum foil underneath. There was a simplicity that was easy to like. There were things that he did that I thought to myself, my God, I could have done that, or I should have thought of that. And they were always things that were accessible and obvious, yet I never saw anyone else do them. And they always seemed to work. There was a sense of, like, I don't know what to do, I'll try this, or it's there, and it always seemed to work in some strange fashion.
I really don't know what he felt when he was painting. I know that he was so prolific and painted so much that it must have kind of been obviously a very pleasurable and maybe even meditative process. I think we all would recognize that Jimmy had different styles. He would take a motif and he would work with it, and then he would add another small thing and he would work with that motif. He went from his numbers and he went to his letters. He had his cup series. Not only did Jimmy have this reverence about how his artwork looked when it was finished, he also really didn't care about the permanence of the materials that he was using. So this painting that I've had for 20 some odd years, the Z's are disappearing, and I have thought seriously, I've actually went out and bought stencils because I was going to stencil the Z's back on because that's how he made them. And I haven't done it yet, and I think Jimmy would say, go for it, Linda, do it. Put the Z's back.
At an intellectual level, he was responsive, and he understood the language of what was going on visually around him, as well as literally and poetically, I cannot disassociate the creative activities of Jim from Jim. That was his reason for being, as far as I was concerned. Anything else he did was completely incidental. And so he taught me a great deal. In a way, he taught me to be able to go out of the line, so to speak, with the crayons. And for this, I will always remember him. He was a very positive force in my intellectual approaches to what I thought art was.
I could not imagine Jim walking down to the store without making all the connections mentally of things that he saw and heard artistically, as he would if he were writing a poem or painting a painting or building one of his magnificent little sculptures. It just seemed to me that Jim had a piece that would not go away, and that was a creative processing of all things around him and making an artistic statement. It was like Jim was a conduit for everything that seemed to be happening.
I don't really know about Jimmy's training as an artist. I know Jimmy was one of the most well-read and well-versed and well-educated in art movements, art histories, artists than anyone else that I've ever known in my life. Jim's art and Jim's eye is a gift, is a rare gift. But I don't think he had any formal training other than working with a cadre of people who he considered to be close friends and people whose work he admired.
We went to the museums on some occasions together and look at exhibitions together. We didn't always agree. He would attribute more power or force to the artist that we were looking at than I would, but that's personal preference. But still, he would come to me and bring 100 pieces of paper with black and white drawings that he had done over the week or two previous. Now, in order to do that, a man had to be working many hours a day. The stuff was extremely esoteric, very abstract, very, very personal, and very, very exciting. And you had to respond. But conceptually, he was a giant, and it came out of the activity of just creating. I mean, he didn't intellectualize what he was going to do. He just kept pumping it out all the time, just pumping it out, and wonderful things happened. Now, if you look at his work, you begin to see that the variety of tools that he picked up, anything worked. Letters, rubber stamps, spray cans. It could fall off the painting 10 minutes after it was applied, but that didn't make any difference. Those were the tools he used. I mean, he was just responsive to everything that was lying at his fingertips. And thinking back, I think this was just a greatness.
However, there was an aspect to Jim, unlike myself, where he was a student, and he never looked at anything without contemplating it. And it's one of the things that he passed on to me was our friend Don was over at the house, and the three of us were sitting around, and we all had some workout. And Don walked in with these white paintings, and they were washes over a dominant color sphere, and he laid them out on the floor, and Don went out to the car, and Jim and I were sitting there, and Jim looked at me, and I looked at Jim, and I said, "I don't like them." And Jim said, "You can't dismiss this work that quickly." He said, "This work requires you to look at it a little bit longer." But I have never looked at work since that time again that I didn't allow myself a little more time to look at it. And it's one of the things that made Jim grow as an artist was his willingness to hang in there, to not readily dismiss things that weren't necessarily flying across his radar. That's what enabled him to soak up stuff as an untrained artist and apply it in his very personal, skilled way.
I'm Ellen Tyack, the widow of Jim Tyack. I've known Jim since 1968. We met in San Francisco and learned about the real creative process that he went through. The paintings behind me are fairly recent and reflect a theme that always runs through his paintings. When he goes through a particular period, there'll generally be an object that's found in the paintings of that time. So in these paintings, often you'll see the word blue or you'll see the cup. Also reflective of Jim is his ability to create art out of found objects. And that's the type of person that Jim was, where he always found objects to combine into a painting. For all the years that I knew him, he worked a lot with stencils. And you'll see that more in his earlier work, but still continues to some degree. This painting has the blue in it, and it has those circles which are actually made from CD discs. Painting over here on the wall is much older, and you can see where he has the stencils with the 78 and the Z. Another blue painting over here, but also has the 78 stencils, so you're seeing a little bit of the transitional period. I think that one of the things about Jim that's most telling is that his ability to just find art in everyday objects around you. The comment that we most have heard when people would come to the house is, "I've never seen so many paintings anywhere." And I think most people wouldn't have a bathroom that's a bit like a gallery. Again, we have some of Jim's found objects, some of his transitional periods. The houses was a period that he went through prior to the ducks and the cups. Jim had a lot of work. He was absolutely prolific. The sculptures are just symbolic of his ability to take found objects, the sardine cans, the rake, but they're also a pain in the neck. Every time I dusted over here, this lamp would fall off, which by the way is a little miner's lamp. Jim's sculptures are they're great. They're absolutely great. His ability to do all this little tiny work, actually what I would say to him is, you've just got a little too much time on your hands. Here's a self-portrait. You can tell from the use of the stencil in the back that that's not so recent. But I think one of the most clever things that Jim ever did were his paper bag hats. This is a prime example where he would take just a brown paper bag, roll it up, and then just put a wonderful array of objects on it. Again, the bones. He always talked about bones and stones. He really liked to color stones. When Jim was painting, I think he had a couple of things that was going through his mind. First of all, I think that you would see his sense of humor and his cynicism. I think that's something that was often projected. But he was a person who had a lot to say, and in both writing and painting, he was able to do that. This is an interesting painting over here. It's actually Joel Oppenheimer, who was the poetry columnist for the Village Voice, that Jim had a nice relationship with for several years before Joel passed away. And that would be Jim's way of paying tribute to him. We used to go through big fights every year or two because this whole ledge would be filled with his sculptures. And I would say to him, "I'm not dusting another thing. I can't stand it anymore. I want everything out of here." So we'd clean it out, and well, within a couple of weeks things would start creeping back, because as he made new things, we had to show them off and spend some time looking at them. This is Jim's study. And because it's his study, I would say that these are his favorite paintings that are in here. I know that he liked that blue very much that's on the wall over there. One criteria for determining whether or not he felt that a painting was good or whether it needed some more work, when he would be working on a painting and he thought it was done, he he would put it on the couch and he'd ask me to come and look at it. And I'd take some time and I'd look at it. If I didn't like it, he knew that he did a good job. This painting was not done by Jim. This was done by a very good friend of ours, Lou Donato. And it even has, he's wearing that paper hat that we looked at earlier. And this is one of our favorite paintings. Art was a means of expression, a means of working out some of his feelings, some of his stresses. But he just couldn't stop. I mean, this would be what Jim would be sitting in that chair watching TV. These would be among the same things here. Even says February 6th, and he died exactly a month later, March 6th. But he couldn't even just sit in a chair and watch TV without always writing or drawing. Actually, I really didn't know about his abilities when we first lived in San Francisco because we were in a small apartment that we shared. It wasn't until we got our own places back in New York, our own place, where he really had the room and the space to work. And wow. This is Jim's studio. Both of us were really happy when we moved into this larger house and Jim could have a dedicated space to work in. He worked in mixed media, but his favorite thing was always working with spray paint, but he used crayons, oils, just a whole bunch of stuff. Here are some of the stencils that you see, like that he's used on a lot of his paintings, and this was the last one that he finished, is right here. At one point, Jim was into a phase where he would take paper, sometimes paper towels, sometimes regular paper, and he would paint on them. And then he would wet them and iron them. And that created this kind of little crinkly aspect. It used to drive me crazy because he ruined my irons, he ruined my ironing board, but he did a great job. One of his older paintings is up there on the wall, and that's something that I really like. That painting's probably about 40 years old. One of the few representational paintings that he's done. The large paintings over here are a lot of his more recent work. And I think he was just more exuberant. I think that he was into, in the last year or two of his life, I think that Jim was really into producing a lot and just trying to get all the feelings out that he had bottled up inside, all the things that were happening, and I think that's why he just started working with just much bigger pieces. Jim also wrote, and it was an interesting process because a couple of months he would write, a couple of months he would paint, a couple of months he would write, a couple months he would paint, occasional crossovers. But I think that his painting has been just mostly accelerated in the last year of his life.
Hi, my name is Max Tyack. I'm Jim Tyack's son. I've grown up around his art my whole life. My father painted and used whatever was laying around. He wasn't very particular when it came to the media. It could be painting on a closet door. You could be painting on a piece of cardboard. Quite often, he would never go out and buy canvas and stretch it himself. He's more likely to go to a garage sale and pick up an old oil painting and then whitewash it and do his own work right on top of it. These paintings in particular, he did a whole series like this. They're known as the Cup series. And he used to give these pieces what he called the treatment. Now these are done on regular paper. He would do the painting with marker, pen, crayon, and when he was done, he would take it, he'd crumple it up into a ball, put it in a coffee pot full of coffee, then put it in the microwave, wrapped in a wet paper towel for about 1.5 minutes, take it out, and then iron it with an iron. And it would get this, you'd get this wrinkly effect, and it almost looks like parchment. He'd often take a painting, even one that might have been hanging up in our house for years, and just decide, you know, I'm going to redo that. And he'll just take latex house paint, white paint, and just wipe over the whole thing. But not so much that you would still see a little bit of the old painting would come through. And he'd do another piece of work over it. And often he may do that 5-6 times on the same painting. So you get this illusion of depth. And sometimes it was intentional, and sometimes I think it was just because of the lack of availability. And you see here he created an effect where he must have used a stencil to create this edge along this piece to give it some cohesion. And he would incorporate all different types of things. And for instance, this is something that was done on a computer, and he would use just squares of cardboard and spray over them and use those as stencils, and then he'd go over those edges with a crayon or something to give a little more definition. And he would just take whatever was laying around, you know, an old envelope, some stamps, clippings from the newspaper, and I really don't know what gave him the inspiration to use those types of things, why he chose those things, but you know, pretty interesting to me. And I don't know if there is a meaning behind the art. You know, it may just be, you know, why the cup. Maybe he just likes the look of it and nothing more than that. Sometimes when you look at a piece of abstract art, you think there must be some type of hidden meaning there. It's got to mean something, but it doesn't have to. Sometimes it doesn't mean anything. It's just lines and color, and it's something in and of itself. It's not really representing anything, and I think my father tried to bring that point across with his work.
The stuff that attracted me to Jim's work immediately are things like this. I mean, the face. I mean, I don't know. That's my entry level. The dog, these faces, this kind of wacky, childlike drawing, and then what the heck is this postage stamp here? What are these for? Are these from like girlfriends around the world? What does it mean? Does he like soul music, checkerboards? You know, I think Jim would be mad if I intellectualized it too much, but I know there's that piece in him that was working. Whether it was working on the strong side or the weak side, it was always there. And I think every time he got to a point in anything where he felt like it was being too controlled or too intellectualized or too artistic or something, he'd just love to spill a cup of coffee on it and smear something or grab some mustard and put it up in the corner. Whatever he seemed to reach for to put in seemed to work in his paintings. I could picture him here, you know, looking for a piece of lattice and or cutting a piece of wood to go around the edge, and then realizing that he'd cut it 1/2 inch too short, and rather than get pissed off, take a piece of gum or something off the table and stick it in that hole and put a little paint or spray paint the corner of it or something and be done with it. But it was all done without any calculated or contrived. There was no contrivance in anything he did. It wasn't like he was doing wacky things to be wacky. It was how he enjoyed working, and I think he was passionate about everything that he touched and did without measure. It didn't matter whether it was a figure, a number, a chalk line, a scratch. It all had the same value, and so did everything he worked with. He was fearless with what he would grab next off the table and put down. And I used to come in here sometimes, and I could not, he'd tell me he was working on a painting, and I'd have to look for it on the table. It never was right there. It was always covered, and something was leaning on it. And you could put a cigarette butt on the end of it or something, and talk for a while and let it burn. And if there was a burn mark, it wasn't that he had done it on purpose. And if he liked it, fine. If he didn't, he'd pick up a can of spray paint and spray over it or something. But he'd usually put a CD under it or something to that effect. What I saw Jim do, I took some of that, and I've been able to pull out. I've been able to make a fast, quick statement. He allowed me to be a little bit less rigid, a little bit more risky. I love spilling things on my paintings.
Watching him and his use of material, anything that was in his hands, a spray can, a checkerboard affair. Some material here with line, it's just uncanny how he put things together. No real concern for the archival aspects of the work. Whatever suited him is what he put down. His use of the word as interchangeable almost with the use of color. In other words, a painter might pick up a paintbrush and put in a dash of red. Jim would put the word cup down or horse in place of a color and try to evoke some visual response. I thought that was a very interesting thing about his work. So he started to break some of the boundaries, some of the visual boundaries that have been prevailing in art for a long time. I've just always been very excited about Jim's work. I hope that he will be discovered, and I think that he deserves a real place in American art.
In front of me, I have a prized chair. One thing that may not have been said about Jimmy was that he was not only exceedingly prolific, but Jimmy was very generous with his artwork. If he started a new motif or a new style, he would make lots of them, and if he liked you, you were lucky, and you got one of them. Again, this is something from his generous spirit. This is really quite good because we have the bones. Jimmy was big into bones. I actually made myself a bone necklace because he influenced me that way. He's got the paper towel and kind of watery ink motif on the lid, which is paper towels were not safe when Jim Tyack was around. If I thought about Jim's work and what should happen to it, I would sincerely hope that someone would come in and catalog it to preserve it. It's not in all that permanent condition. As we all know, Jim used impermanent materials, and there's so much of it here. It should be cataloged, it should be shown. He had a tremendous influence on anyone whose life he touched, especially artists. I think all of us started to play a little bit more in the materials that we use because of Jim's playfulness. So we were all a little less hesitant to grab a rock or to grab a pencil or grab a lump of clay and transform it into something else, because Jimmy was there to encourage us to do it.
Let those schemes for tomorrow turn to dreams we dream tonight. Yeah, let those dreams, let those schemes for tomorrow turn to dreams we dream tonight. And may our dreams see that this broken world turns out all right.